My name is Margaret Ellis, though most people call me Maggie. At 59, I never imagined I'd be starting over. Yet here I was, standing in the driveway of the house that had belonged to my parents. It was a place I hadn't seen in years. A house steeped in memories I wasn't sure I wanted to confront. But after my divorce, the thought of staying in the city, alone, surrounded by reminders of a life that no longer existed, was unbearable. The house sat at the end of a quiet lane, its white shutters peeling, the porch sagging slightly under the weight of time. Yet there was a beauty to its decay, a charm in the way the ivy climbed the stone walls and the hydrangeas bloomed wildly in the garden. It felt like the house was waiting for someone to breathe life into it again, just as I was waiting to rediscover my own. The first weeks were exhausting. I threw myself into the work, cleaning rooms layered with dust, polishing wooden banisters worn smooth by years of use, and uncovering treasures my parents had tucked away in the attic. There was a strange comfort in the rhythm of it all, in the way the house seemed to respond to my care. Yet, as much as I tried to fill my days, the nights were a different story. They stretched endlessly, quiet and heavy with thoughts I couldn't escape. Memories of my marriage crept in, moments of love and laughter that had eventually given way to resentment and silence. I would lie awake in the bedroom that had once been my mother's, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake by choosing this solitude. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I received a call from Henry, my son. He was 27 and had stayed in the city to continue his work as a literary editor. "Mom," he said. His voice warmed despite the crackle of the line. "You sound tired. Are you okay out there all by yourself?" "I'm fine," I lied, not wanting him to worry. "The house is keeping me busy." "Well, I have a surprise for you," he said, a hint of mischief in his tone. "A friend of mine is heading your way. He's working on a restoration project nearby, and might need some help settling in. I thought you two could connect." I hesitated, unsure of how to feel about having a stranger in my carefully curated isolation. "What's his name?" "Oliver," Henry said. "Oliver Grant. He's an architect. You'll like him." A week later Oliver arrived. I spotted him standing on the porch as I returned from the market, his hands tucked into the pockets of a worn leather jacket. He was younger than I expected, tall, with sandy brown hair and a shy smile that softened his sharp features. "You must be Mrs. Ellis," he said, extending a hand. "Maggie," I corrected, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but not overpowering, and there was a warmth in his eyes that immediately put me at ease. We spent the afternoon talking over tea in the sunroom. Oliver told me about his work restoring historic buildings and the charm he found in old architecture. There was an earnestness to him, a kind of quiet passion that reminded me of Henry. "You're lucky to have such a wonderful son," Oliver said at one point, his voice sincere. "He talks about you all the time." The comment caught me off guard, but I smiled, touched by the thought. "He's a good boy," I said, though my heart ached with the realization of how much I missed him. Over the following weeks, Oliver and I fell into an easy routine. He would visit the house often, drawn by its charm and the quiet it offered. Sometimes he would sit in the library, sketching designs or flipping through books on architecture my father had collected. Other times he'd join me in the garden, helping to clear weeds or plant new flowers. One afternoon, as we worked side by side under the warm spring sun, he paused to wipe his brow and looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "Why did you come back here, Maggie?" he asked. The question was simple, but it stirred something deep within me. I set down my spade, brushing dirt from my hands. "Because I needed to," I said finally. "This house, it's the only place that still feels like home. After the divorce, I didn't know where else to go." He nodded, his gaze steady. "It makes sense. Sometimes we have to go back to where we started to figure out where we're going." His words lingered with me long after he'd left that evening. There was a wisdom in them, a quiet truth that I hadn't allowed myself to confront. As the weeks turned into months, our conversations grew deeper. Oliver shared stories of his work, his admiration for preserving the past, his belief that architecture was a way of connecting people to history. In return, I found myself opening up about my marriage, the years of trying to make something work that had long since fallen apart, and the fear of starting over so late in life. "I think you're braver than you realize," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, the scent of jasmine filling the air. "Brave. I repeated, laughing softly. I don't feel brave, Oliver. Most days I'm just trying to get through. But you're here, he said, his voice firm. You've chosen to rebuild, to face the unknown. That takes courage. His words touched something deep within me, a part of myself I had buried beneath years of self-doubt. For the first time in a long while, I began to see myself not as someone who had failed, but as someone who was still capable of creating a life worth living. Yet, even as our friendship deepened, I couldn't ignore the questions that began to surface. The warmth of his presence, the way his laughter filled the quiet spaces of the house, the ease with which we shared our thoughts. It all felt so natural, so right. And yet, there was an undercurrent of something more, something unspoken that neither of us dared to name. I told myself it was impossible, that the difference in our ages made any deeper connection absurd. But late at night, as I lay awake listening to the creak of the old house settling around me, I couldn't help but wonder, was it truly impossible, or was I simply too afraid to believe otherwise? Weeks turned into months, and the house began to feel alive again. The garden bloomed with vibrant flowers, their colors spilling over the once untamed hedges. Inside, each room seemed to reflect a little more light, as though the house itself was grateful for the attention. It was hard not to feel a sense of pride in what I'd accomplished, but I couldn't deny how much of it was due to Oliver. His presence had become as steady as the rhythm of the house, a quiet force of encouragement and companionship. He came by often, sometimes with sketches tucked under his arm, other times with fresh ideas for projects. One day, he brought over a set of old blueprints he'd found while working on a nearby estate. I thought you might like to see these, he said, spreading them out on the dining room table. The plans depicted an intricate design for a Victorian-style greenhouse, complete with ornate ironwork and cascading glass panels. My eyes widened as I took in the details. It's beautiful, I said, running my fingers lightly over the faded lines. Would you ever consider building something like this here? He asked, his voice tentative. I laughed softly, shaking my head. I can't imagine where I'd even start. I've never done anything like that before. That's where I come in, he said with a grin. We could work on it together. It doesn't have to be as elaborate as this. Just something that suits the garden, something that feels like it belongs here. The idea sparked something in me. A greenhouse could be the perfect addition to the property, a way to honor the house's history while creating something new. All right, I said, surprising myself with my own enthusiasm. Let's do it. Over the next several weeks, the greenhouse became our shared project. Oliver handled the design, meticulously planning every detail, while I helped with the practical decisions where it would go, how it would integrate with the garden, and what plants we might grow inside. There was something thrilling about seeing the structure take shape. Each beam, each pane of glass, felt like a step toward something tangible, something beautiful. Working alongside Oliver only deepened the connection between us. He was patient, thoughtful, and endlessly encouraging, and I found myself looking forward to our time together more than I cared to admit. One evening, as we stood in the garden admiring the half-finished frame of the greenhouse, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, Maggie, he said, his voice soft, you're really good at this. At what? I asked, laughing. At bringing things back to life, he said. This house, this garden, even this greenhouse. You've made them all feel like they belong again. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. I think I needed to bring something back to life, I said quietly. The silence that followed was comfortable, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. But beneath it there was a tension, a quiet awareness of something unspoken between us. As the days went on, that awareness grew harder to ignore. There were moments when our hands would brush as we worked, or when our eyes would meet and linger just a little too long. I told myself it was nothing, that it was simply the closeness of our friendship. But late at night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but think about him. His laugh, his smile, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. The greenhouse was nearly complete when Oliver invited me to visit one of his restoration projects. It was an old manor house on the edge of town, a grand estate that had fallen into disrepair. I thought you might like to see it, he said as we walked through the overgrown gardens. It's got a lot of history, just like your house. The manor was stunning, even in its neglected state. Oliver spoke about the work he was doing to preserve its original features, The hand-carved moldings, the stained glass windows, the intricate tile work. You really love this, don't you? I said, watching the way his face lit up as he talked about the project. I do, he admitted. There's something about old buildings. They've seen so much, held so many stories. It feels like an honor to bring them back to life. His passion was infectious, and I found myself drawn to the way he saw the world, not as something to be discarded when it grew old, but as something to be cherished and preserved. Later, as we stood in the manor's crumbling library, Oliver turned to me with an intensity one wasn't prepared for. You remind me of this place, he said. What do you mean? I asked, taken aback. You've been through so much, Maggie, he said. But you're still standing. You're still here. And you're more beautiful because of it. His words left me breathless, and for a moment all I could do was stare at him. There was something in his eyes, a vulnerability, a sincerity that made my heart ache. Oliver, I began, unsure of what to say. But before I could find the words, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. The air between us felt charged, as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us. Then just as suddenly he stepped back, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to make things awkward. It's not awkward, I said quickly, though my heart was pounding. He nodded, but the moment had shifted, leaving behind a tension that neither of us knew how to navigate. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But the truth was, I couldn't ignore the way he made me feel. The warmth, the excitement, the terrifying possibility of something more. The greenhouse was finished a week later, and it was everything we had imagined it would be. As we stood inside, surrounded by the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the glass, Oliver turned to me with a smile. We did it, he said. We did, I agreed, though my mind was racing with everything I couldn't say. As we locked up for the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that the greenhouse wasn't the only thing we were building. There was something growing between us, something fragile and unspoken, and I had no idea where it would lead. The greenhouse had become the heart of the house. It stood tall and proud in the garden, its glass walls catching the sunlight during the day and reflecting the warm glow of lanterns at night. Inside, rows of potted plants thrived, their green leaves and colorful blooms filling the space with life. It was a sanctuary not just for the garden but for me. Oliver and I spent hours there, tending to the plants, arranging furniture, and dreaming of ways to make it even more special. Yet, as much as I cherished our work together, I couldn't ignore the unspoken tension that had lingered since our visit to the manor. He hadn't mentioned what he'd said to me that day, and neither had I. But his words haunted me. The way he'd looked at me, the raw sincerity in his voice, it had stirred something deep within me. I told myself it was impossible, that the difference in our ages made it absurd. And yet, there was a part of me that didn't want to let go of the possibility, no matter how foolish it seemed. One evening, as the first hints of autumn crept into the air, Oliver arrived with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. For the greenhouse, he said, grinning as he held them up. We should celebrate properly. I laughed despite myself, shaking my head as I took the glasses from him. You're determined to turn this into a tradition, aren't you? Of course, he said, his smile widening. Every great project deserves a toast. We sat on the bench inside the greenhouse, the soft glow of string lights casting shadows on the glass walls. The wine was rich and warm, and it seemed to loosen the edges of the tension between us. Do you ever think about what's next? He asked, swirling his glass thoughtfully. What do you mean? For you, he said, his gaze steady. The house, the garden, you've done so much here. But is this where you want to stay? I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. When I first came here, I thought it was just a place to escape, somewhere to figure out what came next. But now it feels like home again. I don't know if I could leave it. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I understand. I think that's part of why I love restoration work. It's about finding the balance between preserving the past and creating something new. You've done that here, Maggie. You've brought this place back to life. His words were like a balm, soothing the doubts that had lingered in my mind. But as I looked at him, I couldn't ignore the questions that remained. What about you? I asked, my voice soft. What's next for you? He paused, his gaze drifting toward the glass ceiling. I'm not sure, he said finally. I came here for the restoration project, but now, I don't know if I want to leave. The weight of his words settled between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to confront. As the weeks went on, our friendship grew closer, but so did the tension. There were moments when the lines between us blurred. A lingering touch, a shared laugh that felt too close, a glance that lasted a beat too long. I found myself looking forward to his visits more than I cared to admit, and I could see the same anticipation in his eyes. One afternoon, as we worked in the greenhouse, a sudden storm rolled in. The rain pelted against the glass, creating a symphony of sound that filled the space. We stood in silence, watching as the wind bent the trees and water streamed down the panes. It's beautiful, I said, my voice barely audible. It is, he agreed, though his eyes weren't on the storm, they were on me. I turned to him, my heart pounding as I met his gaze. There was something raw and unguarded in his expression, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. Oliver, I began, unsure of what I was about to say. But before I could finish, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of warmth through me. I can't stop thinking about you, Maggie, he said, his voice low and trembling. I know it's wrong, I know it's complicated, but Don't, I interrupted, pulling my hand away. My heart was racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. We can't do this, Oliver. It's not right. He looked at me, his face a mixture of hurt and determination. Why not? Because of what people might think. Because of our ages? None of that matters to me. It matters to me, I said, though the words felt hollow. The silence that followed was suffocating. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. You didn't, I said quickly, though I wasn't sure I believed it. It's just complicated. He nodded, but the light in his eyes had dimmed. I should go, he said, turning toward the door. As I watched him leave, a part of me wanted to call him back, to tell him that I felt the same way, that I was just as scared and confused as he was. But I couldn't. I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us or if I even should. That night I lay awake, listening to the sound of the rain against the roof. The storm had passed, but the questions it had left behind remained. What if I was wrong? What if this connection between us wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace? And yet, the thought of what others might think, of what Henry might say, was enough to keep me frozen in place. I had rebuilt this house, this garden, my life. But was I brave enough to take the next step? Even if it meant risking everything? The days after the storm were filled with silence. Not the comforting kind that Oliver and I used to share, but a strained, heavy stillness. He didn't come to the house, and I told myself it was for the best. I needed space to think, to sort through the jumble of emotions that had taken root in my heart. But the truth was, his absence left an ache I couldn't ignore. I threw myself into work, hoping the routine would quiet my mind. The greenhouse was complete, and the garden was flourishing, yet it all felt hollow without him there. Every corner of the property reminded me of Oliver. His laugh as we planted flowers, his focused expression as he sketched plans, the way he had looked at me that day in the rain. Henry called one evening, his voice cheerful as he asked about the house and the garden. "And how's Oliver doing?" he asked casually. I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. "He's busy with his project," I said, my tone deliberately neutral. Henry chuckled. "He's always busy. But I'm glad you two hit it off." He told me the greenhouse turned out great. The mention of Oliver sent a pang through my chest, but I forced a smile. It did. He was a big help. After we hung up, I sat on the porch, staring at the greenhouse as twilight settled over the garden. Henry's words lingered in my mind, and I realized how much I missed the ease of my friendship with Oliver. But could we ever go back to that now that everything had changed? A few days later, Oliver came by unexpectedly. I was in the greenhouse watering the plants when I heard his voice behind me. "Hi, Maggie." I turned, my heart lurching at the sight of him. He looked the same calm, steady, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Hi," I said softly, setting down the watering can. I didn't think I'd see you again. I wasn't sure if I should come, he admitted, stepping inside. But I needed to talk to you. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit on the bench. He hesitated, then sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I'm sorry, he began, his voice low, for what I said the other day. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, I said quickly, though the words felt inadequate. It's just complicated. He looked at me, his expression earnest. I know it is. But I meant what I said, Maggie. I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I think you feel it too. His honesty was like a jolt, forcing me to confront the feelings I'd been trying to bury. I looked down, my hands twisting in my lap. I do, I admitted finally. But that doesn't mean it's easy. There's so much to consider. What people might think, what Henry might think. Oliver leaned forward, his gaze steady. I can't promise it'll be easy, he said. But I think it's worth it. You're worth it. His words left me breathless, and for a moment, I let myself imagine what it might be like to take that leap, to stop worrying about what others would think and follow what my heart was telling me. But fear crept in, wrapping around me like a vice. I don't know if I can do this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Oliver reached out, his hand brushing mine. You don't have to decide right now, he said gently. But I needed you to know how I feel. Whatever happens, I'll respect your choice. The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. He wasn't pressuring me or asking for more than I could give. He was simply laying his heart bare, trusting me to handle it with care. As he stood to leave, I felt a surge of panic. I didn't want him to go, but I couldn't find the words to ask him to stay. Oliver, I said suddenly, my voice trembling. He turned, his expression hopeful. Thank you, I said, the words catching in my throat. For everything. He nodded, a small sad smile on his lips. Take care, Maggie. After he left, the greenhouse felt emptier than ever. I sat on the bench, staring at the plants we'd nurtured together, and wondered if I just made the biggest mistake of my life. The following days were a blur of indecision. I replayed our conversation over and over, torn between my fear of what others might think and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. I thought about the house, the garden, the life I'd rebuilt here, and I realized how much of it had been shaped by Oliver. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself walking toward his workshop. The door was ajar, and I could see him inside, bent over his sketches. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mix of surprise and hope. I thought you'd be asleep by now, he said. I couldn't sleep, I admitted, my heart pounding. He stood, watching me carefully as I stepped closer. What's on your mind? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But then I remembered the courage he had shown in being honest with me, and I knew I owed him the same. I'm scared, I said finally. I'm scared of what people will think, of what this might mean. But more than that, I'm scared of losing you. Oliver's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching for mine. You don't have to be scared, he said. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. For the first time, the weight of my fears began to lift. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew I couldn't let fear dictate my choices. As we stood there, the workshop quiet around us, I realized that sometimes the scariest risks are the ones most worth taking. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something beautiful.